Hello, my name is Parker,
And my name is Ned.
and this is The Force Unlimited, yet another Star Wars Unlimited podcast. This is episode number 3. We're recording today on November 26th, and thank you for joining Ned and I as we have our most boring conversation of the week about the most exciting game on our shelf.
Really? On our shelves?
With the caveat that, I admit that tagline would work better if the game were actually on our shelves. I have some print and play copies on
You
my
have the print
shelf.
play copy. Yeah, no, I was
So,
shelf space is at a premium in my household. So I as soon as I get the copy, it's going to be displacing something, and I have to make some tough calls.
I've got 5 Kallax Cube shelves that are just for card games, but I think there's some Game of Thrones that's going to have to get boxed up somewhere. Ned, how was your Thanksgiving?
It was lovely. I spent some time with some friends and had a good old time. Yourself?
Mine was delightful. But I have been thinking, Ned.
Mm-hmm.
So in our first episode, which was 2 weeks ago for us, about 2 hours ago for our listeners, since we are dropping our first 3 episodes all at once, about Timmy's. And we had a nice conversation about kind of the changing perception of both Timmy's and Spikes, that Timmy was originally a pejorative term. And I found a lot of personal enrichment. Enrichment's not quite the right word. I found a lot of just, it felt warm fuzzies to be like, yeah, Timmy's are awesome. It's not pejorative. But I think one of the key phrases for Timmy's is, or Tammy's, is hard cast fatties, turn them sideways.
Yep.
That phrase has not always sat well with me. And for a variety of reasons, I've never loved that phrase. That phrase felt a little pejorative, a little problematic. That being said, it's my favorite thing to do in card games. There's absolutely nothing better than just paying all the resources you need to for Devastator or for Home One and just not cheating it out, just playing it, right? I've never loved that phrase. So I want to use the power of my platform, all 2 of our subscribers, thank you, Mom, for good, to be the change I want to see in the world. So I think when you honestly play a unit, when you honestly cast a creature, the more appropriate term is the Timmy Tammy Slam. I think.
Okay. I see where you're going here.
I think that is a nice, strong description of what you're doing. You're just throwing that card on the table, and it feels good. So you're hurt. Much like Fetch, I am going to make that happen.
Well, I believe in you, Parker. I believe in the power of the bully pulpit. So if Tim Tam Slam becomes the new statement
Timmy
for it,
Tammy Slam.
Timmy Tammy Slam.
Timmy Tammy Slam.
I am 100% behind it.
Okay. Awesome. Now, before we get into today's segments, and we have 2 topics today we want to talk about, but the first thing we always talk about, as always, Ned and I played a game just before we hopped on to record. Ned, tell us a little bit about the game and your takeaways.
Do I have to?
Yes. Please, no. In great detail. Who played who and who won?
I was running back with some small modifications, a red-yellow tempo deck that I had done really well with IG-88 as the leader. And Parker was running a Krennic red control deck. And I just, from turn 1, where Regional Governor came in naming Greedo with the 1 playable 1-cost unit in my hand being Greedo, through to the end of the game, I was just always behind, which is never what you want to be on a tempo deck. You gotta leverage being ahead early and then just shutting the door. And I never got anywhere, and it was just getting ground down brutally.
It was a lot of fun. I think the most fun I've had prior to tonight was with the Krennic in green, and then last week Vader in green. And as much as green speaks to me, the best cards, the most enjoyable, most fun I had playing was Fifth Brother, the promise of the Emperor Palpatine, combined with, I just love Krennic's ability, big butts, gotta love them. And so I said, let's put them together. Let's see what I can do by just mashing those 2 together. And yeah, it felt good. Felt real good.
No lies detected about your love for the large rumped.
Yeah. No, it was, my wife, so you're gonna pay for those statements.
Oof, oof.
But no, I absolutely huge creatures, big defense. I like being on the back foot. That's where I'm comfortable. I want to be defensive. I want to be a turtle. More of that in our second segment. Let's talk about our two segments tonight. First, we're going to talk briefly about complexity. I have some gut feelings, and I'd really love, Ned, for you to help me structure those into actual formal arguments. And then after that, we're going to go over some basic deck construction at a very high level. Ned's going to kind of guide me through some base principles because it's not something I do a lot of. And then I'm going to remind Ned that we need to tie it into Star Wars Unlimited and make it applicable to the cards that we have in front of us.
Absolutely. My amateur game designer is showing, I'll do my best to keep it on topic and not to digress into Cloud Castle land.
Perfect. All right, here we go. So our first topic today is about complexity and briefly, relatedly, why I'm excited about Star Wars Unlimited. I have a basic grasp of complexity in games. I think a pretty decent hip reaction to how much complexity in a game is fun and why complexity in a game might be unfun. But that isn't great for getting into discussions on the internet, and it's not great for pitching games to our mutual board game friends of varying skill levels and tolerance for complexity. So I kind of want to break down complexity and also why it speaks to me about Star Wars Unlimited.
So on that note, I have had a lot of experience with inflicting unfairly complex things on people. So I would say to Parker's chagrin, maybe is the right word there. But
I have play tested
I
some
haven't.
garbage. I think
Oh wow! Shots fired.
you've been
But
withholding the good game from me. To be fair, I haven't gotten a chance to play
I'm
test the
working.
best one.
It's getting polished. This one's getting shined up.
No,
But
I'm
yeah,
excited. I but we're here to talk tonight about
yeah,
Swoop, and I want to say I
yes.
think it's funny because Ned and I are very excited about Star Wars Unlimited, but I also think it's fair to say that Ned and I like Star Wars. But I'll be the first to admit that I don't love it. That's not a comment on Disney or any modern stuff. I've always liked Star Wars. Top five pulp science fiction IPs in my book. At my heart, I'm a Trekkie. And I think it's fair to say Ned and I like trading card games. I tend
Yes.
to play big. My forte is tabletop role playing games. Ned's forte is history games that take 9 hours to
Yes.
play. In Ned's defense, I have come to start enjoying history games that take 9 hours to play. But neither of us are big TCG players. We've never traveled, I think, to a world championship. We've never traded in $1,000 of one deck for $1,000 of another deck.
No.
And yet, we're doing a podcast about Star Wars Unlimited. And the reason why, and I want to talk about Magic for a moment, and I'm going to come back
Sure.
to Star Wars Unlimited. So, Magic the Gathering, the elephant in the room, the card game against which all other trading card games are compared.
Digital or physical?
Yes, I mean,
Yeah. No. I think yeah.
I think it sets the bar for all card games. It's the
Yes.
Godfather, it's the grandfather. Everything ties back to that. It's like Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. It's like Citizen Kane or The Godfather, or these
Dungeons
movies
and
that,
Dragons and fantasy role playing games.
right, Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy role playing games, exactly. But that still goes back to
Yeah.
Tolkien, right? Everything
Right.
ties back to Magic. You can't have a conversation about trading card games, digital or physical, without talking about Magic the Gathering. Now, on the one hand, Magic the Gathering is a freakishly complex card game. Commander is the dominant format right now, just completely cannibalizing Standard. And if you want to roll up to a new game of Commander, you meet some friends in a new town and they invite you to Commander, you've got to learn, you got to understand what double-sided cards are, you've got to understand sagas, you've got to understand adventures, you've got to understand who is the monarch, you've got to understand everything from banding to battlefields. There's so many rules in Commander, right? In Magic, it's this
Yes.
monster of a game. But at its core, Magic the Gathering is an incredibly simple game.
Yeah.
At its core, you can make a deck of Magic the Gathering cards that is just basic lands, vanilla creatures. And I'm going to assume that you know what vanilla is, but just to define my terms, vanilla means a unit or a creature with no abilities. French vanilla means one with a keyword. You can make that deck, and that is a game. That is a viable game. I don't think it's fun, and I think viable is not the best metric. But
it was viable back in '94.
Well, I don't mean competitively viable. I mean viable as a valid game, right?
People will have fun with. Yeah.
I don't know that people would have fun with pure vanilla, but you can make a deck, and I've done this, of pure sorceries and French vanilla cards. And you can teach a 6-year-old how to play Magic the Gathering. Leave out all the other card types. Basic lands, French vanilla creatures, sorceries. And that's a borderline fun game. I mean, maybe not the most fun. But if you ramp Magic up to the most fun, it becomes Turing complete, right? But you can have basic fun with this very small core, and then you start adding in. Well, these are enchantments. These are instants. These are planeswalkers, right? Like, but the core is very simple, and I think that speaks a lot to Magic's success. Obviously, first mover advantage is huge. Obviously, Wizards on the Coast, aggressive corporate maneuvering early in the life cycle of TCGs, also huge. But I think the idea that you can explain how Magic works. It's a dude smasher. You have these dudes. You put them on the table. You turn it sideways. You throw the dudes at your opponent. You whittle their life down. There's a very simple core, and then you have layers, right? And I in my head have been referring to that as kind of like the complexity onion, right? You have all of these layers, and it builds out from there.
Don't you mean an ogre? Because the last time I checked, ogres have layers.
Okay, yeah, fair. It's been a while since I've seen Shrek, so that sounds right.
You're missing out.
That sounds correct to me. You know what? All Star's been carrying me for 15 years. My son listens to it all the time. I haven't felt compelled to listen to watch the movie again, because I hear All Star on a nearly weekly basis. But yeah, that sounds right. So Magic is a complexity ogre, right? And I think that's you compare it to games with like a simple buy-in, but also kind of a low complexity ceiling. I'm looking at these from the outside. I'm not taking shots. My understanding from nerd osmosis is that games like Pokemon, Lorcana they're easy to get into, and then there's a complexity ceiling. And I think more importantly, though, you also compare that to Fantasy Flight's previous forays into the competitive card game sphere. L5R, Netrunner. These are games that are have a high ceiling for play, and yet also have a very high barrier to entry, right? In that there's a lot of complexity. Netrunner, you can't make like a very simple deck. There's too many card types. You can't just say, well, here's one type of breaker and here's one type of ice, and that's all we're going to use.
It just doesn't work. Yeah,
it doesn't work. With the bluffing component and everything, you've got to have a wide variety of card types. And for me, people have been talking about the new FFG, right? That Star Wars Unlimited speaks to this new FFG, and I think nothing speaks to that. Exhibit A for me is the simplicity of SWU, the ability to teach it very quickly. And I don't want to fuse too much longer, right? Like, anybody listening to this is probably already on board with Star Wars Unlimited, but there's something about that, and I kind of want to dive into why I'm excited about that, because compared to all of the previous FFG games, which have been complex and good, I've been fans. I own a ton of Game of Thrones. I own a ton of Netrunner, all of the co-op ones. I bought a not insignificant amount of Star Wars LCG. They've all had a reasonably high base complexity. And you compare that to Star Wars Unlimited, which I think is much closer to Magic's base complexity. You can teach it. It's real easy. You put these dudes out, they attack, they do damage. There's 2 arenas, but there's only 3 card types in your deck. I mean, it
Yeah.
feels very clean, elegant, and simple. And yet, one last thing before I unleash you, Ned.
Yeah.
And yet, we've only seen like 3 or 4 vanilla units, right?
Hmm.
At first, when they launched, I was like, ooh, this might be too simple. And yet, in a core set, they just keep releasing units or spoiling. They haven't released anything yet. They keep spoiling units that are that have not just keywords, but and plenty of keyworded units, but they also keep spoiling units that just have unique abilities on
Ability
them.
text. Yeah.
And that feels to me that like there's plenty of complexity left in Star Wars Unlimited, but it's all in the cards, it's not in the rules.
Hmm.
And I think that's really where I got on board. That's when I started SWODB, is when I realized, oh wow, this has the potential to get Turing complete. But I can teach this to my, maybe not yet, but one day, right?
Okay. Okay.
They're working on set 9, and that
Sure.
is when
Sure.
they'll be able to build a state machine with Star Wars Unlimited. But I can teach this game to my kid, right? He loves it. So that's all gut feeling, right? Complexity
Yeah.
Ogre is not I don't believe, unless I, struck gold, a defined term in traditional standard game design circles. How so I need to have a better grasp of complexity so that I can kind of map that to my understanding of SWOO. So I guess I'm talking about complexity, and I keep using this word, and I understand what it means in English, but Ned, what does it mean in game design? What is
Yeah.
complexity?
So complexity means different things to different people, and so we're going to be going with my understanding of complexity. And one of the core ideas of complexity in game design is the idea of a game tree. So if we consider a very simple game tree, it would be if I do A, then Parker has 2 choices. Let's call them 1 and 2. If I do B, Parker has those same 2 choices, 1 and 2. And how exactly does the final state payout depends on the choices that we make. So,
So like a logical decision tree, like
yes,
a tree graph with the
yes,
edges and
exactly.
nodes. Okay.
Yeah, this is the core idea behind complexity, and the decision tree. The bigger that the decision tree gets, fundamentally you are dealing with a more complex game, and that's not all that complexity is. There's some additional like hinky bits to it that I think are worth talking about. But as a core approach, it's how big does your decision tree get, and how different are the leaves of your decision tree as you move forward. Because if they all
Okay.
end up in the same place, it's not interesting.
So I'm a very interested amateur gardener. As you know, Ned, I have a lifelong
Yes.
dream of being certified as a master gardener because that just feels like the most elitist hobby title you could get. A tree with one leaf is a dead tree. So I know
Yes.
that much. I'm with you that much.
So, as a designer, you have a limited amount of complexity that people are willing to tolerate. And Parker has experienced the upper limit of game complexity that people are willing to tolerate in some of my earlier designs. But you have a budget that you have to work with. And the better you can, just like with a budget, you can spend your budget well or you can spend your budget poorly. And how you spend your budget is going to determine the kind of tree that you grow, the complexity that you end up with, and how people feel about that.
Okay.
So, um, some games have a barrier to entry. So, like there is a certain complexity. We'll call it like a floor that you must pass through the complexity floor before you can actually play the game. Up until that point, you can sort of move levers, but you're not really playing the game. So I think the classic example of this is traditional fighting games. So not like
Like
platform
fighting video
fighters like
games.
Smash, like fighting video games. Yeah,
Okay.
where when you're playing a fighting video game, you have a bunch of movement options that are available to you. You can move forward and backwards. You can crouch. You can jump. You have your buttons that you can press of your different kinds of attacks. And you have special moves that you can do that require specific combinations of movements and buttons, right?
Okay.
And for a lot of people, when they approach a fighting game, there is too much stuff going on that you have to keep track of at one time, and so you just mash buttons.
I feel like you've watched me play these games. Okay. Yeah.
couple of times. But for people who are really into fighting games, once you get through that and you're able to get past the like technical execution hurdles of moving your character and doing the special moves and hitting the right buttons, there's this really elegant sort of physical chess aspect to it where you're having to make decisions in real time based on what your opponent is doing, and there's a lot of game that you can get into that I have barely scratched the surface of because it takes a lot of effort to get to the level where you're actually playing the game.
Okay.
Another game that to the point of boring historical games that take 9 hours, although this one doesn't.
I was hoping for a
9
tabletop
hours.
example, so
Yes.
hit me.
Twilight Struggle is a game that I love and I have taught several times. But Twilight Struggle, which is a game where one person is the U.S. and one person is the USSR, and you're doing like a simulated Cold War.
That was the one that was a longtime dominant #1 on Board Game Geek, right? And
yes, exactly.
then fell off once everybody else discovered board games, and other than pure
Whoa,
nerds.
shots fired. It's still a very good game.
Yep.
But Twilight Struggle has a knowledge barrier to entry. And what I mean by a knowledge barrier to entry is it's a card-driven game where there's a deck of cards and these cards have certain effects. And there are a couple of cards that you have to warn people about before they go into the game because they have very innocuous text on them, but if you play them at the wrong time, you will lose the game immediately. So to basically, if it is your fault that you start nuclear war, if it is your turn when nuclear war breaks out, you lose. And there are several cards where you would play them. They don't look like they do very much, but your opponent can immediately use the fact that you've enabled them to do something on your turn rather, to cause nuclear war and end the game. So you have to. The early game is playing around these cards to make sure that you're not accidentally causing nuclear war. And until you understand these cards and what they mean, and beyond just the pure, like, you lose the game cards, there are several cards that are designed to provide historicity, but also mean that an early USSR advance into Japan is very likely to be completely negated because of certain cards that will come up. Similarly, a early U.S. advance into France is very likely to be negated just because of the cards that are in the deck. So you have to know what is in the deck to a certain amount. You don't have to memorize the whole deck.
This feels like games like Race for the Galaxy, where you explain the rules, but then you also have to explain kind of a weird meta that you have to learn before you can even be a viable competitor. And again, the earlier examples like Netrunner, here's what the cards do, but then also if you're not aware of traps in a Netrunner deck, then you're just going to get blown out. If you don't realize that even though they've explained that some of these cards could just be support, but an upgrade, but if you run into face first into a trap and you're not aware of it, that can just cost you the game. So there's the teaching the game, and then the minimum threshold of skill to play the game.
How many times? How you have to explain Scorched Earth to somebody,
right?
In Netrunner, or else they are going to have a bad time and they are going to get mad at you.
You can also just teach by playing, right? Like
yeah.
So everybody's got to lose to Queen's Gambit, right? Like everybody's got to lose to Fool's Mate once. Right?
Fool's Mate, Scholar's Mate. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the high floor.
Yeah, high floor. You also have games that have a lower ceiling. So
I inferred.
Games, these are games where the better you get at them, the less fun they get. So
I have a lot of those games.
Oh God. So there's a lot of like traditional kids games, Candyland, and a lot of roll and move games. There's no like game there. You're not, if a game is a series of interesting decisions, Candyland is determined at the moment that the deck is shuffled.
Right. Yep.
Tic-tac-toe is a solved game. So if you play tic-tac-toe against people who know the solution to tic-tac-toe, it's not fun. We'll just call it a tie. And then I'm going to point to a couple of genres of game that a lot of people find less fun at higher levels. So an example is what are called Kingmaker games. So these are games where, let's say that you have players A, B, and C, where players A and B are close in score, and player C can attack player A or player B, and whichever player they attack is going to lose. Player C has no hope of winning. So these game decision space of this is how effectively can you whine and wheedle at player C to not make you lose to the other person.
I want to put you on the spot, Ned. Is Commander,
Yeah.
Magic Commander, a Kingmaker game?
Frequently, yeah, and
Okay.
I think that I have opinions about the Commander format, but I feel that that is one of the biggest weaknesses about Commander is that a fair amount of the later game degenerates into strategic whining.
Okay. Okay.
Um, and then you also have like apples to apples alikes are another example of a game that where the better you get at it, the less fun because you're generally I know what makes Parker laugh, and so I know what cards I need to play in order to win hands with Parker, and so whoever gets those cards in a particular hand is where Parker's the judge will probably win, and
Okay.
that's
Okay. So that feels
not
good.
as
So
interesting. Yeah,
Star Wars Unlimited. I've never played Twilight Struggle, and I've
you're
never
missing
actually
out.
played a fighting game. But I mean, I played Smash Brothers at some point in my life because
Smash Brothers is a platform fighter and not a traditional fighting game,
mean,
and I have strong opinions
yeah.
about Super Smash Brothers.
Okay, I've played Mortal Kombat. I think the very very first one on Sega, long enough to realize that required reflexes I did not have. But Star Wars Unlimited seems to
Yes.
have a pretty low. It's a low floor,
Yeah.
and while we don't know if it's going to be Turing complete, it seems to have the potential, like all TCGs, to get a high ceiling. One of my great
Yep.
critiques of games like Hearthstone and Eternal is that they had a high ceiling and they never ran with it, right? Like when they
No.
both dropped, it was like, oh, this could get actually really rich and complex. And then I feel like Eternal has just basically reiterated on the first set over and over. And Hearthstone leaned into the randomization, I think, more than the high skill, high strategy. No shots fired at anybody who loves those games. And so who knows, right? SWU could get complex. It has the potential to
Sure.
be. We don't know
Yes.
halfway into the first set if it
We've
will
s-
be.
Yeah. We've seen 50% of one set of the game. So,
Right.
yeah.
Okay.
So, if we're trying to look at these areas in which we can get complexity, I think it's really important that we talk about like different ways that games can be complex. So we talked about that decision tree metaphor. So if you think about the tree, there are kind of two fundamental ways that you can make the tree bigger. One way
Okay.
that you can make the tree bigger is you can make the tree wider, so that you have instead of choosing A or B, I could choose A, B, C, or D. And Parker, instead of choosing one or two, could choose 1, 2, 3, or 4. So this is growing the game as width.
Okay.
So having more width tends to be more fun because you have more options available, right? Like if at every point you're faced with a binary decision, there tends to be a lot less that you have in the way of choices. And since games are combinations of interesting decisions, the more choices you have, the better. But people get a lot of choice paralysis. Is that if I've got 5 different things that I can do, which one of them should I be doing? And so you want the width to be open. You want a couple of options, but you don't want too many options. And that's something that I think that SWU does pretty well, because the nature of card games is that you're looking at a hand of cards, and those are most of your choices.
I also think the short lifespans of the cards,
Yeah.
and not like L5R where they just time out, but because everything's just being smashed into each other and dying,
Yeah.
you're not the choice space, the decision space is always feels pretty small, right?
Yes.
The game that we were playing, there's just 2 or 3 dudes out at any time. You have 1 or 2 in the space lane or space arena. You have 2 or 3 in the ground arena tops. You're
Yep.
never going to get into this weenie situation where you have 9, 12. I mean, I don't want to say never, but so far.
Yeah.
So
far.
you're never
That's not a common
overwhelmed
situation. Yeah.
with a ton of cards on the opposite lane or the opposite side. Your opponent doesn't have 8 cards, all with weird special abilities, and you have to decide which one. Usually you're looking at a special ability card and a beef card, and you usually like, okay, do I take out which is more of a threat, the beef or the special
Yep.
ability? And so okay,
Yeah,
so,
so-
there's we're gonna say the appropriate amount of width.
Width. Yeah.
Okay, I'm a
So the
reasonably
next-
smart man. I'm gonna assume the other one is depth or
You'd
height.
be correct. So depth
right.
is how many moves ahead do you have to think? So depth is something that's a feature of a lot of sort of traditional games where you're trying to think so many moves ahead of your opponent.
Chess.
And the person who can think, chess is the sort of example where chess is huge amounts of depth. Um, but at the same time, I think chess is also a really good example because chess is hard to approach because every move that you make it has these deeper implications the further you go. Um, if you're not able to think, 3 or 4 moves ahead, if you're only able to think 1 or 2 moves ahead, you'll just sort of consistently lose. And for a lot of people, the mental effort of trying to think 4 or 5 moves ahead is hard. It's if you're trying to play like a fun game, you want to have some amount of outthinking your opponent. But I think that the like n layers deep outthinking tends to get very mentally taxing, and it tends to not be as good of a place to spend your complexity budget outside of people who really like doing that.
So that's solved with, I assume, randomization, right? Like that if you
You can
can't.
fuzz it, yeah. So randomization, it reintroduces width the further you go down, right? Like so, imagine that every time I move a pawn, I roll a die, and on a 6, it changes
Okay.
to a different piece.
And then I assume the
We,
other
if
is
we
that
play like
is hidden
pretend chess,
information
right?
hides.
Hidden information can constrain the depth. Another way is you can reset the board. So what in SWU things that you do is on each turn you have so many resources to use and you have your units that are in play. Generally there's not a lot of like units that ambush effects you can treat as it comes into playability. Let's not go too deep down the rabbit hole. But you have your units that are on the board at the start of the turn, and you have the cards in your hand, and you have a certain amount of resources. And you are trying to think some number of moves ahead of your opponent, and you're trying to sequence, but your sequences kind of terminate at the turn boundary a lot of the time. Is you have a pretty good idea of what your opponent's trying to do. I have a pretty good idea of what I'm trying to do, but I don't have to think, you know, three
Past
turns down the line. Yeah, because
I have to
I'm gonna
solve
have more
this turn,
resources.
and then we'll see what
Yes.
happens. Okay. Yeah, I guess that was
Exactly.
with draw two, right? Draw two
Yes.
seems to add a lot of
Yeah.
decision based on last week's game. Draw
Yeah.
two adds a lot of information that you can't plan around. You have,
No.
I quickly lose track of what's in your hand. There's too much
Yes.
unknown to really evaluate beyond what I can see in front of me and just kind of generally what I know of decks like your deck.
Yeah. To go back to the match we played this time, I knew you had a Palpy. I couldn't really play around it, so I had to kind of gamble on maybe you resourced it because you were feeling like resourcing it. But yeah, no, I think that that's sort of the core thing is that because you're resetting, this information is getting lost, and so you cannot make these long chains of logic that you have to go through.
Is that a concern? I mean, on the one hand, playing Palp felt like such a fun decision because you
Yeah.
only had about 3 or 4 HP on the board
Yeah.
when I played Palpatine, and so there was this kind of tension of if I wait, I tried drawing it out
Yeah.
with attacks, but at a certain point,
Yeah.
I either had to play Palpatine or play something else, and
Yeah.
if I played something else, then now I can't play Palpatine. I didn't have the resources
Yeah.
for both, and so it was an interesting decision of do I play Palpatine not able to take full advantage of it because you only had like 3 hit points on the board.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, is that a too high a seal or too low a ceiling on the ability to on the depth of the tree that everything seems to
I don't
reset
think
really
so.
quickly? Okay.
I mean, I think that you're making a lot of interesting decisions on your turn. There are a fair number of branches to the tree, and I think a lot of it comes down to the I go, you go. Is that if I go first, if I attack this unit versus if I attack that unit versus if I attack your base, trying to think through the implications of that combined with I do have some information about the cards in your hand a lot of the time. And so having that information, I think that you can go reasonably deep, but you don't not necessarily too deep that it's hard to think. And I think another thing that will happen is as people get better at the game, you will start to sort of automatically have an idea of what the next couple of moves are, and so you're not having to explicitly go through those those sort of steps of the logical chain. You can kind of shortcut forward. I know you have a palp, so playing around that, knowing somebody is very likely to be running overwhelming barrage, trying to make that a hard decision for them. I think is an interesting can end up being interesting without being unnecessarily deep. David Serlin, who's kind of a beehole, but that's neither here nor there. He has this concept that he calls Yomi, that is basically you can have a tree with kind of 3 steps of like rock, paper, scissors, and if I'm on, if I know that you like rock, then I'll go paper, but if you know that I like paper, then you'll go scissors, and so then I should go rock and yada yada yada, and it goes
The
around in a
Princess
loop.
Bride.
Yeah,
I know that you know
exactly.
that I know that you know.
Exactly. That it gives depth without having to have too many layers deep of thinking, because it kind of returns to its starting point in terms of depth of
So similar to
logical
how the
inference.
Netrunner Psy game usually
Yeah.
just kind of solved itself of there's basically how much
You're betting
risk are you willing to
0
tolerate.
or yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I'm assuming we're talking about a mathematical tree and not a real tree. So there's just really 2
Yes.
dimensions. There's width and there's depth, and
Yeah.
that's how we measure complexity.
So there is one other element of complexity that I think is really important to talking about with paper games, um, tabletop-ish games. It does apply with computers, and that is resolution complexity. Is that how hard is it mechanically to do a thing?
Okay.
So an example of a game where there's very complicated resolution complexity is a lot of war games. If you're attacking your units into another space, you have to, look up on you roll a dice and your opponent rolls a dice, and then you're adding up all of these attack and defense factors, and then you're cross-referencing it in your combat results table, and then that means that their unit is like retreating or holding firm, and who's taking losses and how much. And so mechanically, like going through all of those steps is difficult. In like the tabletop role playing space, moving from stacking up like +1, -1, +2, -2 modifiers versus advantage based mechanics where you're rolling just like some number of die and you take the higher. Um,
So in a card game,
Fundamentally,
I'm
you're
thinking
yeah,
you and I play a fair amount of Arkham Horror,
yes,
which great game. I'm a fan,
yep,
but you often run into these situations where it's like, okay, now before you do this thing, take these 6 cards, shuffle them into this
yes,
deck, shuffle then again with this
yep,
other deck. All the
yep,
players now need to draw from this deck and shuffle it into their deck, and then draw one
yep,
card. And that was a lot
yes.
of physical finger moving for
There's a
what was
yeah,
really one decision or no decision.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, no, exactly. And this resolution complexity is, in my opinion, kind of poison to a game where it's in you have a certain amount of complexity budget, and if you're losing some of your complexity that you can spend on having to do these like mechanical steps of resolution complexity, then you've lost complexity that you wanted to that would be maybe better spent in other places.
Okay, well, I'm not.
But
When
yeah,
we play currently, we kind of have to play our games on Tabletop Simulator,
yep,
and I feel like TTS, if it's automated, can remove some of that resolution complexity. There are
yes,
certainly games where you can click a button that says next
yep,
round and it does
yep,
its thing, but for the most part, it's actually the other way that it makes any
yes,
resolution complexity worse because instead
yes.
of just doing a thing with my hand, now I have to press
You
buttons to make
go
things.
over and you grab the stupid token from the bucket, you put it down, and then you click
But you
on
put
the
it in the
token
wrong bucket
yeah,
and it just
yeah,
so.
yeah.
And playing SWU on TTS, I feel like it's
So
been
fast.
really
Yeah,
fast, right? The games are
yeah,
just blitz, and so I can only imagine they'll be faster in person. So that feels like one that we can kind of just
yes.
shove aside. We don't need to worry about too much.
Hmm.
So okay,
No, yeah,
that
I'd agree.
that
And
this talk has felt a little bit
yeah,
navel gazing to me, but it's given me some vocabulary to talk about complexity. Uh,
hmm,
I I think SWU. My gut feeling was that it was a good game from a complexity standpoint, but now
I have no evidence to the contrary. I've had fun every time I played it.
I
So,
can say things like it has a very low barrier to entry, it has a
hmm,
reasonably high potential complexity ceiling, has the
yep,
right kinds of decision tree depth and breadth,
yep,
and low resolution complexity. I think those are the
hmm,
magic words I'm supposed to say to sound like I know what I'm talking about. Do you have anything else you want to add to the conversation then?
yes, Parker.
Okay.
My time here is Ogre.
No, I absolutely not. I'm editing that out. I refuse to put that in the video. No. Okay. We're gonna cut like 5 seconds before that. It's just gonna be an unanswered question left hanging. Okay. For our second segment tonight, we've talked a little bit about how Star Wars Unlimited plays, but there's a whole second component to any trading card game, which is deck building.
Yeah.
Now, I have historically been a what is called a net decker. In fact, I'm the ultimate net decker. Rather than go out on the internet and find decks, I built a website where the internet can come to me and give me decks, and then once a week those are backed up onto my own machine. If the internet goes down, I still have thousands at this point of decks that I can go play with. So, no objection to net decking. However, Jyn Erso recently spoiled, and I thought I was safe. The three yellow leaders spoiled so far, Boba, Han, and Thrawn, they seem really good, but they didn't speak to me, right? They didn't speak to my play style. Thrawn was close. Like seeing cards, an infinite amount of exhaustibility
Yeah.
seemed nice. But the cards didn't really like say, this is a leader that I have to play. But then Jyn Erso was spoiled. And that leader speaks to me. And it spoke to me because it's kind of this conservative efficiency, right? Just lowering your opponent's power when you attack them, just makes for like safe trades, and safe trades are my favorite kind of trades. I'm risk averse. So then I was on the Discord for the unplayables. Shout out to both a great YouTube channel as well as Discord community. But I was on there when I kind of came across the idea of a blue Jyn Erso deck, Vigilance, which would kind of pair that really high hit points with the low opponent power. And I had what I thought was a reasonably clever idea for a deck, which was a deck name, which is 90% of where I start, Bombay Sapphire, as a blue Jyn deck. And that's what I've got so far, right? But I want to build a deck. As I alluded to in our last episode, Star Wars Unlimited is awakening aspects of TCG exploration that I've not historically cared about. So I have no idea where to begin. So let's just walk through, Ned, some high-level concepts of building a deck. I can only assume, based on your desire to make sure people don't have fun and your comprehensive understanding of TCG mechanics, that you love building decks.
I am awful at building decks. I'm gonna own this.
Okay.
I'm on the Net Deck Express. I tend to find some pet cards and just sort of build around pet cards, and that's not necessarily the way that you want to do things. But I've read a lot of TCG theory, and I'm kind of like a father bird. I'm regurgitating the worms of TCG theory to try and help my chicks.
Okay, I will be your chick. That is, I mean, I net deck the way I shop for recipes, which is I have an idea of two ingredients that I'm like, man, Oreo waffles. And then I have a high confidence that I can't be the first person who thought of Oreo waffles. I'm not going to try to figure this out on my own. I'm going to go on the internet. I'm just going to Google Oreo waffle. And somebody's written about their trip to Pennsylvania with their dad and how they found that puppy. And by the way, here's a recipe for Oreo waffles. And now I've got it. And that's how I build decks, right? Here, what two cards seem like a blast? Okay, I'm just going to go find decks that have those two cards because I can't be the first person who thought of that. But okay, let's be awful at this together. Let's figure out how to build decks. Teach me what you know through osmosis of building decks.
What I have picked up. I want to start off by noting that even though, as we are both net deckers, there is zero problems with net decking, and I personally, in my personal opinion, if you have problems with net decking, that's on you.
Okay.
Is that one of the best places to start with building decks is what decks have other people built that have worked, and like trying to reinvent the wheel every time that you're building a deck seems ridiculous to me.
For me, I think a lot of the criticisms of net decking stem from people wanting to defend bad games or bad metas, and I realize I had some very subjective hot takes about sideboards last week, and I'm only willing to put myself out there so far. But I think if net decking solves a meta, and net decking creates an environment where everybody's only playing 3 games,
Yeah.
then you're on Magic Arena queuing up into the same 2 decks over and over and over again. That's not a problem with net decking. That's a problem with some combination of the game, the meta, the format of legal cards, and also the nature of the competition. Best of one ladder will incentivize certain cards, but some combination of those 3 things create an environment. Net decking just gets you to the kind of optimal topography of a game state, of a meta state quicker, right? And we've seen this in Magic, that Magic Arena allows for faster discovery of a meta than had maybe happened previously.
Oh yeah, back in the Dark Ages, you were like looking at tournament results that were published on a website maybe once every couple of weeks, whereas on Arena now, like there's instantaneous updating of people's spreadsheets and things.
Right. So I feel like criticizing net decking is criticizing what it discovers, right? Net decking shows us something, and you might not like the thing that it shows you, but there are plenty of games out there that have incredibly healthy, diverse metas with lots of decks and net decking, and net decking doesn't get rid of that. So it just, play a better game, right? Or just acknowledge that maybe you've wandered into a bad meta and we found it faster, and developers have to solve.
Hope that the designers or that will release new things or ban cards or whatever the competitive format is going to do to try and make it more fun.
Okay,
so
dear listener, I hope you are pro net decking. Ned and I are pro net decking. If you are opposed to net decking, please email us at podcast@swoodeb.com, and we will read it and then explain to you at further length why you are wrong. So, okay. Pro net decking podcast. Here we go.
Yep.
Let's build a deck.
So these are kind of typologies. These are ways that you might approach, similar to how we did like the psychographics. Not every deck is going to be able to be described by these, but these are, if I'm starting with a semi-blank canvas and I want to build something, this is how I might go about doing it.
I have a leader, a deck name. That's okay. So give me some approaches.
All right. So one approach is that you can start off with a theme. So the example of a theme would be like an aggro deck or a trooper deck or a space deck or a mill deck, right? Where these are, I want to do a specific kind of thing, right?
So like a broad feeling. Typal would be...
Typal, like, in Magic, like a goblins deck.
Okay.
Right?
But so troopers or rebels, that's a you're saying that's top down.
This is what I'm calling a top-down approach,
okay,
where you're focusing initially on how you want the deck to feel. And then by focusing on how you want the deck to feel, so an example of how I want the deck to feel, I want this to be an aggro deck, so I want it to play quickly. An example of what you talked about, a typal deck, like I want to build a trooper deck. I want this deck to feel like I'm playing a bunch of troopers. Typically, you start off, it's good for a first pass into an environment. So
an environment meaning like a new meta or a new set,
meta, new cards, or even like a part of the meta that you don't explore. So like, for example, if I say, Parker, I know you love to play the old Timmy Tammy Slam. Can you try and build a event-based control deck?
Okay. And that's my theme is event-based control.
Your theme is event-based control. Just see what you can get. And this will tend to force you to look at cards and evaluate things in different ways. But it also tends to produce decks that are very samey. Because if you think, so an example of this I think is a Hera. If you're building like a Hera Spectres deck, the way that you build the deck is you pull up SWODB, you search for trait Spectre, and you put those cards in the deck.
And you're halfway done.
And then
you just pick good stuff from whichever color that you want Hera to be in. So if you want to make a blue Hera deck, then it's Hera plus blue stuff, good blue stuff. If it's a green Hera deck, then it's Spectres plus good green stuff. And okay, So okay, so little samey, little risk there of,
Yeah.
but I do like good stuff. Okay, so I've sworn. I mean, good job referencing Hera.
Sure.
That's one way. How else
Yep.
might you approach this?
So another way that you can do is you can approach from a bottom up, where rather than starting with a theme and picking cards that fit, we're going to start with a card or a mechanic, and we're going to try and build around that. So this is a bottom up design. So an example might
Okay.
be I want to build a Fighters for Freedom deck, right?
Okay.
I'm building my deck around this card, this specific interact, or a synergy. You know, an example of a synergy might be I want to build a deck that's based around recurring Admiral Akbar, where when Admiral Akbar returns to play, he or enters play, he deals damage. So I want to get Akbar out as many times as I possibly can to treat him as like a direct damage source
Okay.
to clear the board.
So I'm a little confused. Bear with me.
Yeah, sure.
What's the difference between an Admiral Akbar deck as bottom up and a Veers deck as top
Yeah.
down? Right. So Veers +1/+1 to
Imperials.
Imperial units. That's
They can.
you're building your deck
like,
around.
You can,
I mean, is it just the
yeah.
nature of nobody actually builds a Veers deck? You build an Imperial deck,
You
and
build an Imperial deck and you include Veers, right?
And you include
you're not
Veers.
you're not building a Veers deck. You are building an Imperial deck, and my Imperial deck wants Veers because he buffs Imperials, right?
Right.
I'm starting off. I want an Imperial deck. I want Veers. If you're saying
you can
if
put
you're taking
Akbar in a
bottom
deck
up-
with anything else, but you wouldn't
Right.
put Veers in a deck with no other Imperials.
right, and
Okay.
yeah, you could put Akbar like how this like I want to maximize the potential of Admiral Akbar deck looks is going to be very different depending on the solutions that you come to. Similarly, like Fighters for Freedom, let's pretend that I'm building a bottom up Fighters for Freedom deck.
Let's play a
Right.
red card, deal 1 damage.
Yes, play a
Okay.
red card, deal 1 damage to the opponent's base. So, what I want to do is I want to play a bunch of cheap red cards, right? And because I'm playing a bunch of cheap red cards, each time I play a cheap red card, I'm dealing damage to my opponent. So, in order to play my cheap red cards, I also need card draw because I'm burning through my hand to play these cheap red cards. And so that I can keep refilling my hand to keep playing more cheap red cards. I want things that will allow me to recur Fighters for Freedom when it inevitably gets taken down or attacked into or what have you. And okay, I have a board that's filled with cheap red cards. What can I do with a board full of cheap red cards? Well, I can focus on attacking my opponent. So I end up being in this sort of like aggro weenie shell where initially my brewing pattern is I want to focus on this synergy.
Okay. And so this is a typology of deck building approaches, not of decks.
Yes.
So both
Yes.
a top down, I want to build an aggro weenie deck, and the bottom up, I want to build a Fighters for Freedom deck, could converge on the exact same deck.
Most of the time your deck building approaches will tend to converge in similar places because there are we have a limited card pool and there are cards that work with each other and there are cards that don't. If I'm taking a top down, I want to build a scoundrels, like a black yellow scoundrels deck. You're not going to include Veers because most of your cards are not most of your cards are not Imperial, so that won't show up.
Right.
Similarly, if you're approaching from like a bottom up perspective, where I want to play around Bosk, Greedo, and the ISB agent, where these are 3 black yellow cards that all care about having a large amount of non-unit cards in your deck. You're also not going to include Veers because Veers doesn't buff any of them, and he's also not a non-unit.
Sure.
He happens to
Okay.
be a unit.
Okay.
Both of these approaches will tend to they're kind of self-contained. These are the kind of approaches that people will tend to take as like a first pass into a format. I don't know how the format looks. I don't know what the environment is going to look like. I am either deliberately or non-deliberately but accidentally just going to focus on sort of the internal side of things of I want to have this kind of experience or I want to build around this mechanic.
Okay, well, that tracks with where I'm at now, right?
Yeah.
Nobody knows what the format really is.
Yeah.
It's shifting, but let's assume I'm getting ready for the Sparker Rebellion Showdown. We're 2 months,
Sure.
in May, we're 2 months into the set. You're saying these are for exploring an environment,
Yes.
but let's assume I've been playing at our local shop on a weekly basis. I know, or I have a strong sense of what I'm going to encounter. I'm
Mhm.
inferring that there is a hidden third approach that I can build.
There is more than one hidden third approach.
Okay.
So the first of the two hidden approaches is what we call middle out. So an idea about middle out is you look at your card pool, you pick the good cards out of your card pool, and you say, is there a deck that allows me to play all of these good cards? So you might, for example, look at your card pool and say, wow, Boba Fett
That's the good
is
stuff.
a
Yeah.
remarkably efficient unit.
Okay.
What decks allow me to play Boba Fett? I guess Boba Fett synergizes well with Fett's Fire Spray, so let's throw that in too. It's pretty efficient. Um, I guess I'm in black yellow, so I should run the good black yellow stuff. And then what color do I want to splash in? Or, conversely, if you're approaching it from a different direction, I like Admiral Akbar. Admiral Akbar's good. He's, heroism green. What things do I need to include with heroism green?
You
I guess I'm
sound
going to
so
include some red.
sad describing this deck building process.
I hate. So, okay. This kind of approach is pretty successful because you're playing there's a reason why these cards are good. These cards are good because they are good cards.
Right.
And so if you have a deck that is full of good cards, typically speaking, it's a good deck.
Yep. Nope.
Yep.
I want to get there.
But,
Okay.
You know,
I get it.
you're
It's not an interesting
yeah.
problem for you to solve. It's a
No,
simple problem
there's
that's easily
no problem.
solved.
I mean, you are solving an interesting problem, but that interesting problem is how do I spend my money on buying these good cards, number one, and number two, how do I construct my deck in such a way that I can fit all of them into the same deck without them stopping being good because of anti-synergy effects?
I will stand by. I'll eat it when it turns out the meta is terrible because everybody's just running non-synergistic good stuff. But I personally love just playing good cards and loving every. I hate drawing cards that I don't want to play that I thought would be good and then they weren't. So all cards that are universally always good. Every time I draw them, I'm excited to see them.
Yeah.
So
Wow! Oh my gosh, Palpatine! What a great card!
yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
I'm always on board for that. So okay, we can probably I can end this conversation now. I think I've found what I need to discover, but it sounds like there's another one that dear listener might.
There
want to
is
hear.
the last, and that is the most focused of the approaches, and this is working backwards. And so,
Okay.
if there is a metagame in your environment, and this metagame is well defined, can I pick apart this deck that is winning a lot and figure out a way to beat it?
Yeah, what do you mean by sorry, before you go further, what is a well-defined meta?
So, an example of a well-defined metagame is we have been playing for, a couple of months with the Spark of Rebellion cards, and the same couple of decks have consistently posted results. So that's what I mean by a well-defined meta. A meta between two people is typically not well-defined because you might get a wild hair and decide to play something completely different on any given night. So me trying to focus in on your winningest deck and figure out how to beat your winningest deck is typically less successful than the other approach of
I'm a binary state. I either played
Yeah.
my deck or I didn't. Whereas in a tournament of 100 people, 60%.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
If
So
Boba
you're
Green
looking at
is
a
60%,
well-defined meta.
Yeah, you have a well-defined meta. Let's pretend that we have a really unhealthy meta where like Boba Green ends up being 60% of the metagame, as it was in the tournament that recently.
Sure.
So let's look at a Boba Green deck. We might say, okay, well, Boba Green doesn't play anything really on 4. In the current card pool, there's nothing that they really want to play on 4. They don't play a lot of units because they're synergizing into the black-yellow non-unit effects. They're playing relatively few units compared to other similarly sized decks. And the top end typically is not as deep. They're not going all the way to Devastator. They're not going all the way to crud. What's the 8/8 that can't the 8/8 Star Destroyer that cancels events?
That would be starts with an R. There's too many that start with R.
Relentless or something. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
They're not playing
So
high-end Star Destroyers.
they're not playing high-end Star Destroyers. So if they're doing that, how can we counter that? You might start looking at how to build around a specific deck. So you might say, okay, we're going to play a controlling shell where we're going to try and one-for-one them. We're going to try and play single cards that will answer their single units because they have a relatively low unit density if they're drawing a bunch of waylays and the exhaust card, the 2-cost black-yellow exhaust
No
card.
good to be dead.
No good to be dead, thank you. If they're playing a bunch of those and I have relatively few units on the board, maybe that'll work. Or you might take an opposite approach where, okay, they're playing their relatively few units, so if I flood the board with units, their answers to my units are not going to stack up as well, and I can outmaneuver them by just having a much wider board presence that they're not able to answer.
Okay. So
But, yeah.
we have the 4 approaches:
Yeah.
top down, bottom up, Silicon
Yeah.
Valley's own middle out, and
Yeah.
then working backwards from an established answer that you don't want to bring.
Yeah.
So you know, or an established question that you don't want to ask,
Yeah.
so you have to answer.
Yeah.
Awesome. Anything else that I need to know before I run forward with Bombay Sapphire?
Yeah. And this is a very foundational concept, and that is the resource curve. And everybody mentions the resource curve, but it is really important that you do keep in mind your resource curve.
Okay. So that's just making sure that I have cards to play at all resource levels up to whatever level that I want to start drawing to.
Yes, but, and this is where the resource curve is actually kind of an interesting mathematical artifact. And that is, if you, and I know when we were planning this episode, I said there's no "My Name Is Monday" segment this time.
But you can't help yourself.
I really can't help myself. Sorry, I started talking about resource curves. And that
I'm here for you, Ned.
Okay, thank you.
Give it to me.
I'm aware that I have a problem. You know, someday my
First
obsession
step.
with graphs will, one day at a time. Every turn you see more cards because you're drawing more cards every turn. And traditionally the way that you describe the odds of drawing a card as a function of the number of cards that you have seen is something called the hypergeometric distribution. So the hypergeometric distribution looks at the number of draws that you have, the size of your deck, and the number of copies of a card that you're running, where we're going to treat copies of a card as cards of a certain cost. If you want to have a high chance of making plays on every turn of the game, and by that I mean you want to play a 2-resource unit on 2, a 3-resource unit on 3, a 4-resource unit on 4, a 5-resource unit on 5, etc., or instead of a unit, just like a card that costs that much on that particular turn. The way that you optimize this is by leaning much more heavily towards low-cost cards than high-cost cards.
Because you have to draw them earlier.
Right, because the low-cost cards, you have, number one, you have to draw them early, and number two, because you're looking to play them early, you have seen fewer cards into your deck. So the higher cost cards, if you have a relatively smaller number of higher cost cards, you are still more likely to get them even though you have fewer of them in number than your lower cost cards by whatever turn of the game.
You're not going to have 8, by the time you have 8 resources with which to play an 8-resource card, you have spent 7 turns drawing 2, as opposed to a 2-cost card, which you've got to get in your opening hand.
Correct.
Okay. How much does that take into account? You say, like, on when I have 5 resources, I want to be able to play. Do I need to be able to? Does that factor in? I want to play a 5-resource card, or is that I want to play 5 resources worth of cards? Is a 3 and a 2 considered equally successful in hypergeometric? You said distribution.
Hypergeometric distribution. So the way that I approached it is, I want to play a 5-resource card on turn 5 when I did my some quickie analysis that I think is pretty convincing.
Okay.
there may or may not be a chart here, but the core of that analysis, what you said about having, if I could play a 3 or a 2, you can get really far down the complexity rabbit hole. This is a hyper simple approach, but saying that a 3 and a 2 is as good as a 5 should lean you even more towards playing low cost cards.
Okay,
Because
fair.
if
Yeah,
a
yeah.
3 and a 2 is as good as a 5, then play more 3s and 2s so that you can play them on turn 1 and turn 2.
Okay, yeah, yep, yeah, yep.
So
That tracks. Okay.
it's really, really tempting to run a large amount of top end cards. I think in general, and once you're getting beyond turns 5 and 6, you want to, this is the top of the food pyramid, where use sparingly. And this is true. You might think that because you're not having to deal with a land system, that you can run more high-end cards. In Magic, you are not guaranteed to have 7 mana, 7 resources worth on turn 7. In fact, it's extremely likely that you have less than 7 resources on turn 7. Whereas in Swu, you can guarantee you will always have 7 resources on turn 7.
You will, in fact, have 8
But
if you want them.
yes, you will indeed have 8 resources on turn 7. Yes. But even though that is the case, you have to be prudent about the number of high cost cards that you play. And if you are going to play them, you must be willing to accept that you are going to have some dead turns or crummier turns in the earlier phases of the game. And
I haven't had a dead turn 2 yet, but I have had a dead turn 1, a number of them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
dead turn 1s just
they feel bad.
awful. I mean, especially with that 2 resources, right? It's not even 1 resource like a lot of games.
Yeah.
You have 2. I feel like even if luck can happen to anybody, but if you open turn 2 with a dead card and multiple times in the same deck while playtesting, you need to really reevaluate that deck just from that just feels awful.
The advice that I would give is you want to run on the order of 10 to 15 2-cost cards, if not more.
Okay, that's what, almost between 20% to a third of your deck as 2-cost cards, 1 or 2-cost cards.
If you want to if you want to have like a 95% chance of playing a 2-cost card on turn 2, then
how much does that take into account cards like leaders like Tarkin or Vader?
It does not.
Okay, so that fuzzes and zhuzhes the math a little.
That does.
They always,
Tarkin,
they're happy. Tarkin's not sad only having 4 resource cards on turn 4 when he could spend 5, because he can always just bump 1, assuming he has an Imperial card out.
Right, and I think that leans into the kind of decks that they want to play. Like Tarkin wants to, thematically, I feel like Tarkin feels good in a Star Destroyer deck, and that means that you can have fewer lower cost units, because even if you're playing off curve, you're able to get their stats up to the point where they're comparable, so you can run fewer low cost units. You still have to have a lot, but you don't have to have quite as many, especially in like the middle of your curve, because you can play a 3 on turn 4 and make it roughly equivalent to a 4 cost worth of stats. And Vader, similarly, because you're dealing damage when you're playing an Imperial unit, I think Vader is not in the Star Destroyer mold, but more in the like high cost black-red, Palpatine, big force user kind of a thing, where again you can play relatively fewer of your lower cost units and you're still affecting the board as long as you're playing some stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for Bombay Sapphire, I need 10 to 15 cheap units.
Yep.
Big butts, and then just wedge in good stuff.
To taste.
Okay, to taste. All right. I think I've got enough to work with. Thanks, Ned.
You're welcome.
And that's all she wrote. This was episode 3 of The Force Unlimited, and we're recording on November 26th of 2023. This is our launch episode. So the last 2 episodes we were recording in a vacuum. The only feedback was our own as we edited, but this is the first one along with the previous 2. If you're listening to this, it means it's out in the world, and people will be able to hear this. You, dear listener, will be able to hear this before we record episode 4. So please, by all means, we've opened ourselves up to criticism on the internet. Podcast at SwooDB. Let us know if we've failed to normalize our audio or if we've said something wrong about a game that you love. We'd love to hear from you. Ned, if you'd like to explain why I'm wrong, you can save it till the next episode, as always. But if you have any final thoughts, now's your last chance.
Like and subscribe. Smash the bell. Sign up for forceunlimited.com tote bags. Do we have tote bags yet?
We don't have tote bags, Ned. No. It's just your my voice out onto the internet ether. That's all we can offer people is that and graphs. Okay.
I do love graphs.
Yeah, no, I know you love graphs. So, and with that, dear listener, we will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you.